Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in the next couple of videos, I'd like to try to analyze the marriage of Wendi Adelson and Dan Markel. Okay, what I'd like to try to do is just to try to not so much come to a judgment about who's good and who's bad, but just with an open mind, just take a moment to try to understand how Dan Markel got killed. Okay, and sort of like what was the perfect storm? What was the perfect storm of different personalities, different dynamics, different blind spots, weaknesses, whatever. What came together to create the perfect storm that got Dan Markel killed? Okay, obviously, I can't hide the fact, and it's just my opinion, but I'm absolutely sure that the Adelson family killed Dan. Now it's just my opinion, okay, but it is my opinion, and that is my opinion. I'm not stating a fact, but I do believe the Adelsons are responsible for Dan Markel being killed. But my interest in this video is to sort of set aside how I might feel about the family and just try to understand what happened, or at least try to, right? So that apart from just hating the bad people and loving the good people, we can also try to learn something, okay? All of us can try to learn something just because, something as tragic like this, as tragic as this, at the very least, the best that we can hope for is that it at least be a learning experience for everybody, as opposed to just being a tragedy. Okay, so that's kind of my motivation. So basically, what I want to do in this video is focus on the marriage. Okay, in another video, I'd like to kind of maybe try to examine how I interpret, let's say, maybe Wendi Adelson's personality, or maybe her personality together with her brother Charlie. Okay, because I'm just going to let it right out of the bag. I do think there's a lot of parallels between Wendi and Charlie and Lori Vallow and Alex Cox. Okay, I think they have a very similar brother-sister relationship, and I think they come from a very similar family, very similar families. Because I think Lori's mom, I think her name is Janice Cox. I think she is very similar to Donna Adelson. Okay, so there's a lot of parallels going on here, and also, it's interesting that Lori Vallow's homicidal tendencies, whatever, tended to be aroused out of bad marriages. Okay, and so another similarity that, if we're to believe what is my opinion, it's just my opinion. I think Dan Markel's homicide arose from a bad marriage. Okay, and there's a lot of family baggage behind it, but I think that's kind of like the origin of this homicide. So what I'd like to do with this video is just start with, how do I feel, or what is my interpretation, what is my hunch as to what's going on with this marriage. Okay, now I think, just like with Lori Vallow, you cannot look at the Lori Vallow case without considering the impact and the context of Mormonism. Okay, likewise, in this case of Dan Markel, we cannot consider this case without the context and background of Judaism. Okay, now Judaism is very complex. Okay, Judaism is not just a religion. Okay, Judaism is a culture. It's a civilization. It's an ethnicity. And likewise, I think it's fair to say that Mormonism is an ethnicity. I think that's fair to say. But the thing is that, the first thing we have to do, I think, is try to be sympathetic, that it is not always easy to be a Jewish person. Okay, because there aren't as many Jewish. Let's say the number of Jewish people isn't that as well. Living in the United States, you're living in a country of 300 million people. Okay, but the actual Jewish the Jewish population is like 7 million in the United States, something like that. So it's not really a lot of people to begin with. Okay, so even though they live in a big country, they themselves represent the equivalent of like Scotland. Like, I think Scotland has 7 million people or something like that. It's actually a very small population. So for young people, there is natural pressure, just like in the Mormon community, there's pressure to sort of marry within the religion. Likewise, in the Jewish community, there is some cultural pressure for young people to seek a Jewish spouse. Okay, and so right there we have a lot of challenge, because it's not like you're just like in a sea of people, And with that limited population, I think we can understand why a lot of young Jewish people sort of they end up sort of seeking help through like online dating. Okay, so you have the JDate online dating matching service or whatever, and I guess I have to say that like I'm not a big fan of online dating. Okay, and I'm not a big fan of online like matchmaking and all that, because I just think that even if it is difficult for Jewish people, it is difficult for them. I think there's no substitute for actually getting to know somebody in real life, okay, and not having like an instant connection through like an artificial clearinghouse or whatever. So, like I'm a big believer that people should never seek a romance. Okay, I'm a big believer that romance has to grow out of not seeking romance, and that the best thing to do is just to have good relations with people, and just to believe that something like romance will come organically if you just first just integrate and sort of I don't know, just be friends with people and just have like say be active in your social environment. Okay, so I'm not a big fan of purposely seeking a romance, because I think romance is something that just comes organically. And so what I see here right off the bat is that we have two extremely intelligent people. Okay, now obviously Dan Markel, he's quite a bit more intelligent than Wendi. Okay, however, I did look at a Federalist Society a video where Dan Markel gave a presentation as a law professor. Okay, and I could tell you that Dan Markel, while he is extremely intelligent, while he was extremely intelligent, okay, I could see things that, at least in my opinion, looking at his personality, he seemed extremely rigid, very serious. Okay, and he had kind of like a ruthlessness in the way he would reason and debate and formulate his ideas. And there was a kind of ruthlessness in his intellectual, I guess, his intellectual operation. Okay. And obviously a big part of Dan's life was, forming arguments and being, very rigorous in his argumentation. And I have a feeling that may have sort of over dominated his personality, so that there wasn't room for him to sort of put aside the law professor or whatever, and to just also have just a regular sort of down to earth personality. Okay. And so I'm concerned that maybe he may have been a very limited person in terms of maybe being a little bit too dominated by this sort of intellectual, kind of ruthless intellectual kind of that aspect of his personality. I think was so dominant. I think he may have forgotten along the way what it meant to be just an unguarded, down to earth person. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that Wendi Adelson was a down to earth, unguarded person. I'm just saying that, probably in each in their different way, I think both Wendi and Dan probably were so invested, I guess, in their ambitious personalities, each one having a different definition of ambition, but it probably left both of them without much recourse to the part of their personality that could be unguarded and down to earth. So that's a bad recipe right there, because when people don't have, like, say, an unguarded, undefended, sort of just barefoot and just sort of down to earth part of themselves, if that's not strong, you might say you end up with two people that aren't really complete. And generally, the parts of us that are not unguarded, okay, and the parts of us that are not sort of down to earth tend to be very competitive. All right, and so you'll end up with two people that are just overexpressing each the competitive aspect of their personalities. So I definitely saw that when I saw the law professor presentation of Dan Markel in that Federalist Society video, and so I can already tell. And another thing too, he looks like he has an IQ probably in the 150s. Okay, like maybe close to 160 IQ. Okay, so when you have a person that intelligent, like say 155 could be his IQ. I mean, that is so off the charts. Okay, that he would be better off hanging out with like physicists and computer programmers or whatever, but not with a person like Wendi Adelson, who's just like a socialite from South Florida. And while she may be very smart, she may have an IQ of like 138, maybe 140 maximum. She looks like she has an IQ like in the 135 to 140 range. So She's definitely very smart, no question, but she's not even close to Dan Markel. Okay, so right there, they're almost like they live like in different worlds. And you can have a relationship between two people that have wildly different IQs, but that's only if both parties, okay, can sort of set aside their ambitious personality and also sort of open themselves to their unguarded, down to earth part of their personality. But it seems to me that both of them were just caught up in, I guess they're each one's version of their ambitious personality. Okay, so um, anyway, the other thing too I want to mention is that Dan Markel, he almost seemed to be, because he's so smart. I mean, incredibly smart. I think sometimes people that have these IQs like close to 160 or whatever, they may be just a little bit like maybe subclinical, but something on the autistic spectrum. Okay, now I'm not saying he probably wasn't even, he would never be diagnosable as having autistic spectrum disorder. So it's not like clinical, but I think on a subclinical level, you can see sort of a little bit of an autistic aspect, very rigid. And he probably was at home, probably very rigid about, his preferences, probably very rigid about his beliefs, his values. And so he may have been sort of psychologically incapable of providing the kind of flexibilities that would allow him to make a bridge and a connection with somebody who might have a different personality style and maybe a different set of values. So he may have been, just from the beginning, Dan Markel may have been sort of incapable of providing certain essential concessions, okay, so that he could start forming, the bedrock of a relationship. So for example, they're both Jewish, right? But Dan Markel was extremely conservative Jew. Okay, I don't think he was ultra orthodox. He wasn't Hasidic, but he was an extremely conservative, strictly observant Jewish person who was, my understanding, he was pretty strict in his observance of kosher kitchen, and eating habits, diet. Um, and my understanding is that Wendi Adelson came from also a very Jewish family, but they were not so strict about the kosher, and they were probably a more liberal Jewish family. Okay, or just less conservative, whatever you want to say, progressive Jewish people, whatever, just not conservative Jewish people. Okay, so a perfect example where Dan had an opportunity to maybe sacrifice something sort of in that on the path towards, like, say, giving concessions as sort of like a way of building bridges, right? When they got married, Wendy's family took charge of the catering. Okay, and obviously catering for a Jewish wedding is going to be super critical because some Jewish people are very serious about the kosher, others are less so. You may have rabbis at the wedding, and the rabbis may not be comfortable with non-kosher food, so it's very serious. And I guess Wendy's family, sort of in a display of power, because Wendy's family definitely has an instinct towards power, and people who want to assert power sometimes assert provocations. They do it people sort of assert provocations sort of in an unconscious way of seeing if the other person is gonna be gracious about it, right? And so obviously this is very uncomfortable, and I think it made even at least one rabbi that was at the wedding, apparently, as I understand it, was uncomfortable with the catering not being kosher. Okay, so they provided the catering, but I think it was like a paella or something, and it was clearly just not a kosher meal. Okay, and so I think this is very disturbing, I think, to at least one rabbi in attendance, but I think it was very upsetting to Dan Markel, because he's a very strict Jewish person, very strict Jew. And so now this would have been a very difficult moment for Dan, because if he were to concede, he would be conceding a deeply held religious value. Okay, so that would be a tremendous concession. But all I can say is that, people who have the flexibility to make huge concessions, okay, which may even be painful, but knowing that it's in the interest of building a bridge, okay, that can be the beginning of sort of building sort of like the bridge work that can start to form a genuine relationship with another person. Okay, and it doesn't even matter if the other person appreciates it or not. It's just the fact that you're starting to build some commonality with the other person. Okay, but my understanding is that for Dan, it was just, obviously he ended up going through with the wedding, but he wasn't personally satisfied, And so it wasn't really like he allowed himself to really just sort of concede on that and just let it be peaceful. I think he held that as a point of, sort of like a point against Wendi. And, as I understand it, later on in the marriage, he would tell people that he believed that Wendi had, psychological problems. That he believed that she had a very nice sort of outward appearance, but that in reality, Wendi, in his opinion, wasn't really that good of a person. Basically, I mean, he probably had a different way of saying it, but um, and I think that maybe that's evidence that maybe through the course of the marriage, he wasn't able to sort of allow himself to make concessions and just sort of maybe just sort of give in a little bit. You know what I mean? So that he wouldn't end up in the end like forming this idea that my wife is sort of a, sort of not such a good person. In other words, um, I think, for example, like say, take the wedding, that wouldn't have to be points against Wendi as a bad person. That could just be, okay, you know what? I conceded, they have a different value system. Maybe they are imposing this, but, I know human behavior and I know human beings who are powerful. They like to sort of make provocations. So in this case, I took this as an opportunity to make a concession, building bridges, whatever. So you don't have to take from that they're bad people. You can just say, they're doing what powerful people do, and you just take it as an opportunity to make a concession. I mean, now obviously, I'm not trying to say that Wendi's a good person, but I'm just saying that there are no really good people. There do not exist truly completely good people. That does not exist in the world. And so even when you're dealing with somebody who has, let's say, some bad qualities, and it depends, but in some cases you want to at least try making some concessions to see if it's even possible to build a relationship. But in my opinion, I don't think Dan was able to really. Yeah, I think he was too rigid. I think maybe to really give at least the attempt at concessions that could at least open the possibility of seeing if it was possible to have a relationship with Wendi. Now, maybe in the end, even that would not have allowed the relationship to be successful because, I think that in the end, I think he was a little bit kind of autistic, just way smarter, a different intellectual style. So, even with concessions, I think they may have been too far apart in terms of personality to ever really have a successful marriage. But, again, that just goes back to the problem where, like we see, like in a limited, limited population culture, like the American Jewish culture, young people just don't have a lot of options. And so they end up turning to things like, online dating, online matchmaking, and they end up getting connected with people that they don't even really know, And so it just so happens that, they're both lawyers. They both gone to law school. They both had, very, very successful, graduate education. And so, on paper, they look like they have a lot in common. But in actuality, I think that Wendi was a much more social person. I don't think she was more down to earth than Dan, but I think she was more social. And I think her, her just her taste in life, her style was just very different from Dan. Okay, and I think she was even maybe a little less rigid when it came to the Judaism and all that. So in reality, they really did not have that much in common. Okay, and so I don't know. I mean, I guess my fundamental analysis of this marriage was, this is what happens when people don't know each other. Okay, when people try to create an instant romance, as opposed to just getting along with people in the world and just allowing romance to sort of appear organically from the people that you already know. That's kind of my basic summary. But if you really want to get into the bits and pieces of it, obviously, we have a mismatch intellectually, right? Intellectual mismatch, and also a personality style mismatch. Also a mismatch of values, a mismatch of how they approach their religion, and so it's essentially just a cultural mismatch. Okay, now I'm not saying that a mismatch has to be the end of a relationship, okay? But what it does mean is that if you do have a significant mismatch, okay, there has to be some sort of series of concessions, okay, between the two to start forming the bridge work. And so, in my opinion, I just don't think they even developed, even from the beginning, that much bridge work to even give themselves the opportunity to see if it was possible to have a marriage. Okay, now I'm gonna try and explain in other videos, that I do think that Wendi may have some narcissistic qualities. She may be narcissistic. I don't, but at least she does have some narcissistic characteristics. Okay, so we could argue, well, she probably can't have a relationship with anybody. All right, well, the bottom line is in the real world, people that do have narcissistic characteristics, they sometimes can have a relationship. It's probably not as easy. So I can't say that Wendi could never have a relationship with anybody, but she would probably need to have somebody who's already pretty compatible, and also a person who's willing to really, I don't know, kind of let her have her way in some areas, and just not be too, not be too rigid or too difficult. But in this case, I just think that Dan was way too limited to be able to even approach the beginning of sort of developing the bridge work to even attempt to have a relationship with Wendi. So, I think this relationship was doomed from the beginning. And I think in a way, both of them are victims of just having that small population and that limited pool of population, that the Jewish people have in the United States. And so they just ended up having essentially no choice but to sort of look for a romance online, through online dating. And I just think that that's unfortunate, but that's just part of the difficulty of growing up, let's say, in the Mormon world or in the Jewish world. It's a smaller world. And, you have two choices. You can either sort of just pick whoever's around you, and maybe it's not the person you want to be with, or you can just try to be patient, but you're operating in a smaller population. And so obviously the odds are slimmer, and so it is, I can sympathize. But I just think that unfortunately, this is what can happen when you end up connected to somebody who looks on paper, they look similar to you, like say on a matchmaking website, but in reality, they're actually very different, So anyway, so that's kind of my basic analysis of the marriage. But then let's try to analyze, how did this come to the point of actually creating a murder? Okay. All right. Well, just as in the early part of the marriage, how there was just no bridge work developed, and how Dan was kind of limited in his ability to have any flexibility in this marriage. Okay, when they started the divorce proceedings, okay, let's just face it, in the real world and real world litigation, okay, people do not always come to litigation in honesty. They don't always come to litigation playing by the rules or playing clean. Okay, and so in this divorce, Wendi allowed herself to do a few dishonest things. I think, I'm imagining that Dan probably was correct in observing that maybe, or believing that Wendi had maybe undercounted her assets or underreported assets, or maybe done some unfair things by taking an heirloom. I think it was like a ring or some kind of jewel, a diamond or something, that had been a family heirloom from Dan's family. All right. And I guess the intent was that it was supposed to be for Wendi, right? That was the intent. But I guess he believed that because of the divorce, he should take that back, right? But Wendi sort of beat him to the punch. And I think she sort of took possession of that heirloom, apparently very valuable, and apparently had like Holocaust. It came from the Holocaust, or it had connections to the Holocaust. So it was a very serious heirloom for Dan's family. And so she kind of played a little dirty with that. And, and so like, I can sympathize, right? I mean, she may not be playing, like she's not being passive at all when it comes to the divorce, and she's being maybe a little less than honest, maybe whatever. And then on top of that, she wants to take the children to South Florida. So he'll end up being far away from his children, right? So he fights everything. Okay. And he fights at different levels of intensity, but at some point he starts getting very intense in the legal fighting in a way that could even threaten Wendi's even professional standing as an attorney, right? Because he'd be alleging that she committed dishonesty in litigation. That could be very serious for her career. Okay. And at the same time, when Dan found out that Wendi's family was starting to like badmouth him to his children, okay, Dan actually took the step, very serious, of filing a motion in divorce court to try to limit the grandmother. This is Donna ADELSON, trying to limit her not to be able to be alone with children. Okay. Now he may have felt that was totally justified, because he may have felt that it was totally unjustified for them to badmouth him. Okay. But I don't think he fully calculated, maybe because he's a little bit autistic, maybe because he lacks a certain level of social awareness. But I don't think he calculated how infuriating and how provocative it could be for him to actually take them to task on that and actually file a motion, basically, proposing that the grandmother can't be alone with the children. Okay, that could be perceived by the Adelsons as extremely aggressive, extremely inappropriate, even if he had grounds for it, right? And so this is the thing, in litigation, in my experience with litigation, you have to be careful, because just because you have a reason and just because you have cause to file certain motions, right, that doesn't mean you want to go ballistic and you want to just go full nuclear in your litigation. Sometimes you want to let people sort of get away with a few things, maybe not hold them to every single dishonesty. Okay, because in the end, what you may end up doing is just generating a lot of escalation. Okay, and in this situation, maybe Dan just didn't even perceive it, because maybe he just didn't take Wendi very seriously. But just like Lori Vallow, okay, I think Wendi is a super escalator. Okay, and in fact, I'm not even sure Wendi is fully aware of it. I guess it's, you don't always feel in yourself like how escalatory you are, right? But some people are very escalatory. Okay, and just like Lori Vallow was a super escalator, I think Wendi Adelson is a super escalator, and I think her whole family is a super escalator. So it can be dangerous to get into sort of a provocation contest with people who are super escalators. All right, and I think that's a dimension of this chess game that I think that maybe Dan maybe just either wasn't aware of. It was a blind spot for him. He was so tied up in the legal analysis and assessing his legal rights and his legal position, that I think he didn't take into account the psychological aspect. And I don't think he had a fair assessment of what he was really dealing with the Adelsons, that these people would not respond well to aggressive provocation. And so, yeah, it's sad, that sometimes in litigation, you have to sort of let people get away with things a little bit, to a point, but you have to sort of make some big concessions. And I think another big concession he could have made was just to bite the bullet and just to accept the pain, and the sacrifice of letting his children be raised hundreds of miles away in South Florida. Okay, so that would have hurt him, because I think he wanted to be very influential and he wanted to participate in the upbringing of his children. Okay, so he really wanted the children to be raised in Tallahassee, right? But I think in the end, just knowing how important it was to Wendi and her family that the kids could live in South Florida, I think if he had, let's say, if he had maybe just attempted to just accept a painful sacrifice and just allow his children to be raised in South Florida, that might have been perceived by the Adelsons as a very grand gesture. And, maybe on some level, they might have still not liked him, but it might have avoided this super escalatory provocation that I think may explain why he ended up getting killed, because when you deal with people who are super escalators, you're pushing their worst buttons. And for people that are very escalatory, it's not like they calmly think, oh, let's kill this person. When someone is very escalated, that's an altered state. Okay, so if you know somebody is a super escalator, or if somebody is a super escalator, just like Lori Vallow, when they get very, very provoked, okay, sometimes they can end up in a state that is really not even under their own control, and they can end up just forming such hostile opinions and end up capable of doing things that could be dangerous. So now, I'm not saying this is always true, but at least in this case, I think what we're really dealing with from the Adelsons wasn't that they just calmly sat down and said, I think we need to kill this guy. I think they were just infuriated. I think the family was infuriated. And I think because they're super escalators, I just think that because they also have a habit maybe of not feeling like they have to obey the laws that everybody else has to follow, I think it was like a perfect storm where they were just so infuriated and they were so insulted by the way that Dan was standing up for his rights in court, but he chose to do it in an aggressive way. And I think they were just so infuriated and provoked that they just ended up kind of escalating beyond their limits, and just crazy stuff started happening. So it's now, I'm not trying to defend the Adelsons whatsoever. That what they did was totally wrong. Okay, but I'm just saying that we need to understand this as a case of where a very stubborn person like Dan came across very escalatory people like the Adelsons, and the result was sort of like a perfect storm. And so that's kind of my analysis of the marriage. And in another video, I'd like to talk about, if I can, try to talk about how I see Wendi and Charlie's personality. So anyway, thanks for watching.